Hello, friends, and welcome back to Ghouls Night In, the spooky chat show with your best ghoul friends. I'm Penny Snark.
And I'm Midge Munster.
I was thinking about what we could talk about to follow up the Halloween holiday. I just felt like we had to go back to some crazy Victorian action.
Oh, absolutely. I wish you would.
I wish you would. So, Midge, have you ever wanted to see a picture of a dead body?
Oh, I have.
You have.
I know where this is going.
So this is probably not something that most of our modern audiences have craved or longed for. But back in the day, people sure did love to take these photos. So today we are talking about post-mortem photography.
Huzzah.
Huzzah! So a big part of the inspiration for this episode is a book called Beyond the Dark Veil that a lovely friend picked up for me for my birthday. I love all of my friends who give me spooky books for my birthday. Wink, wink, Midge.
Me included.
You included. Which this is a really lovely book that is a big collection of postmortem images along with essays about kind of the meaning and history of the photographs. And then I also did, some of my usual online digging. So let's get into it. In order to have post-mortem photography, photography has to have been invented.
Val, I thought you were going to say, you need mortem.
Well, that also. But we always had that.
Yes,
but we
that's
did
true.
not have photography the whole time.
An excellent point.
So I'm just gonna be vulnerable with you guys for a minute and say that I have been to historic photography exhibits where they explain the process. I read a bunch of stuff in preparation for this episode, and my brain does not want to understand any of how photography works.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm just gonna do my best to kind of give you guys a rundown. So first, there is something that we called camera obscura, and this is based on the natural concept that apparently if you shine light through a tiny hole, it reproduces the things onto the other side upside down because of how light works,
Yep.
I guess. So the term camera obscura was first printed in 1604, but there are descriptions of people using this all the way back to a Chinese text from 5th century BC. So this has been around for a long time, but eventually people were like, oh, what if we added a mirror and we used a spectacle lens to sharpen the image, and that let people reflect the image down onto a piece of paper, where they would then trace the image to create a super realistic sketch.
Yes.
So these kind of camera obscuras were in use by artists in the 18th century, and people were like, this is bitchin', but what if instead of me tracing the image, there was a chemical way to capture it and it would automatically transfer the image? So lots of different people were working on various forms of this in the early 19th century, but the guy who brought his version to the public and gets the credit as the inventor was Louis Daguerre in 1839 with his daguerreotype.
Yes.
Hell yeah.
I feel like
So,
I'm reliving. I took a lot of photography classes back in the day,
ooh,
and I'm like, wow, I did retain some of that somewhere.
good. Welcome back, Midge.
Yeah.
So his method involved treating a polished metal plate and coating it with light sensitive chemical mixture that then captures the image that was reflected onto it. You had to use a special fixing agent, and you put it under glass because it was really smudgeable. But there was a lot of innovation and development of this process over the next few years that made it much faster and more affordable, and suddenly photography exists.
Boom.
Hooray.
You might
And
say in a flash. It suddenly.
hey, you could
Oh.
you it's weird for me to even think about what a paradigm shift this must be,
Yeah.
cuz even in my lifetime, the change from a film camera to instant like phone digital
Just, like,
camera
having
seems just
camera on us at
crazy.
all times, right.
Yeah, and that you would have the photo immediately. Like, when I was a kid, we had film
You
cameras,
gotta
and
go
your
get that
mom
shit
would take
developed.
pictures, and then, like, 6 months later, when you finally finished a whole roll of film, you're like, "Well, guess we'll find out if any of these looked okay."
Yeah,
Like,
literally the, like, "Did that turn out?"
yep, and you have your thumb in half of them.
Well,
But,
yeah, and I mean, at this point, people are sitting for
uh-huh.
hours and hours for portraits before. It's the
Yes.
complete 180.
Yeah. And so, yeah, before this, if you wanted to have an image of a loved one or yourself, you would need to have a portrait painted. This was obviously something that was really only accessible to the wealthy,
Mhm.
because who's going to be paying that art money? And suddenly, this was a new option for so many more people. And since it coincided so neatly with the Victorians and their deep cultural fascination with death, it is no surprise the death and photography got all tied together as well. So, as we've talked about with, traditions like hair art, postmortem photography was really all about memorializing your loved one in a way that was kind of accessible to you at the time. So, there had obviously been a really long tradition of having like a miniature painting of like a dead loved one in like a locket or something. Photography was more affordable than that, but it was still expensive. So, like, it's not like people were snapping pictures all over the place. Like,
Yeah.
getting your photo taken was something that was pretty special and that you would really probably only do for like an important occasion, like dying, I guess.
The
uh
most important occasion.
the most important occasion. So you would have a photo then to, kind of keep in your family album of your deceased loved one. And sometimes you didn't get that photo until they were already dead. So I think a lot of this is like death was so much more like part of your home in these
Mhm.
days. Like, most likely people were dying at home versus, in a hospital. You're generally caring for your dead at home. Often the funeral ceremonies leading up to burial were held, in your parlor
Mhm.
where you had your funerals. So when you're looking at postmortem photos, a lot of them do depict the deceased in like a kind of a final repose in bed or even in the coffin itself, amongst flowers, things like that. And it wasn't too long, really, after the advent of photography that they invented a way to do multiple prints from the photograph. And then obviously, you could provide copies to family members. You didn't have to have like individual paintings done for everybody.
Right.
And that just made it so much easier. But because this is kind of a dark and macabre thing, there are, of course, a lot of myths about this on the internet. Uh,
Sure.
Mhm. So the reality of postmortem photography being a thing kind of just mixes up people's brains, and there are a lot of like clickbaity articles and things like that where
Yeah.
it's like, you won't believe that the people in these pictures are dead. Oh my god. And yeah, that's probably because they're likely not dead. Well, they're dead now, but
Well,
they
sure.
were not dead in that
In that
photograph.
moment, right.
Yes. And a lot of this really goes back to the use of posing stands,
Mhm.
which are metal stands that photographers would use to help people stay still during photos. But there's a lot of misinformation online where people are like, if you see these stands, it means they're propping up a corpse.
Right.
Blah. um,
Yeah, people
which, like,
forget
if
that it took, like it wasn't like a snap photo, like, it wasn't like,
yes.
boom, like, this was a laborious process at that time still.
Mhm. Yeah, so I actually have the facts on it. So when the daguerreotype was first invented, it was like a minute and a half exposure. And then by the 1850s, it was down to just like 3 to 8 seconds.
Mhm.
But that's still a long time to hold completely still.
Yeah.
I looked this up, and apparently modern digital cameras shoot at like 1/4000th of a second,
And we still be
and
getting
I
motion
I
blur.
was gonna say, I still take blurry photos,
Yep.
so I still somehow am blurry in these. So I am not surprised that folks needed some help to hold still. And like if you actually look at these stands, like they're not like counterweighted in any way. Like it just doesn't make any sense. You could not put like a
Dead,
lifeless body
literally dead
on
weight.
one
Yeah.
and have them stand up.
Right.
Like it just would not work. And I did read an Atlas Obscura article that was specifically about kind of like myths of postmortem photography. And it was also, kind of saying like in a lot of these photos, like people look kind of stiff or they're making weird faces where people are like, oh, that's a corpse. And it's like, this person never had their picture taken
Right.
before. Like they don't know what they're doing. I definitely also take weird photos of myself
It
in,
reminds me of
in
like
this
my
year
parents
2023.
when you like look, so my parents have a lot of home videos of like when camcorders first started out,
Oh yeah.
and like my grandma didn't understand that it was like a moving picture. So there's a lot of like
Mhm.
awkward videos of them like stiffly standing like posing like thinking that
Yes.
they're getting their photo taken. It's giving that.
Right. Well, even today, how many like little like video clips are there of people being like, "It's a video," and then suddenly everyone will like waves
Oh, right.
awkwardly. It's just the vibe. And then also, obviously like the processing of photos were not necessarily as like one to one with real life
Mhm.
as a digital camera. So, sometimes, people's eyes look kind of weird or things didn't fully develop properly. And one thing that I enjoyed was this article also blames the film The Haunting in Connecticut,
Oh.
which I did watch last night because they mentioned it in this
Oh.
article. But for those, well, if you have seen it, you probably already know what I'm going to say. And for those who haven't, there is a featured plot point about finding a bunch of post-mortem photographs,
Okay.
because it does take place in a funeral home, and they actually like use the photographs as like the intro credits.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of the photos that you see in some of these like viral roundups are actually photos from this movie, and those were not historic photos. Those were all done with live models, so
Interesting.
they
Okay.
are in fact alive even though they're pretending to be dead in the photo. So that gives you a little bit of extra confusion of like,
Yeah.
ooh, how did that work out? These people look shockingly alive. And it's like, well, they were
Well,
alive.
well, they are. So.
Um, they were alive. Apparently, the studio was probably rightfully worried that if they use actual historic photos, that
Yeah.
people would be like, I'm the descendant of that guy, and you should pay me for putting this in your movie. And they were like, we don't want to fuck with any of that. So we're just
Sure.
gonna do our own photos.
I don't want to like jump ahead of you here.
Mhm.
Um, but that kind of brings an interesting. So, I got to go to that Haunted America conference and see
Yeah.
Amanda Woomer speak about grieving practices.
Hmm.
And she spent a good amount of time talking about postmortem. And I honestly had questions even just about like, especially from a modern lens now, because like obviously at the time this was very normal and like that's just what people did.
Hmm.
If you take off your 2023 glasses. But now, like through a future lens, it's like where does consent fall in that too?
Yeah.
Of like this is a photograph of a person's body still, and they can't consent to having that photo taken. uh I don't know, it poses just like an interesting thing. And then yeah, if you add like putting someone's photo then in a film, it's like, oh, we're walking
Hmm. Yeah.
some weird lines there, better to just not do it.
Yes, yeah, and no spoilers, but the way that they tie into the plot of the film, if it was a photo of my loved one, I probably would not be thrilled about it being
Sure.
in this film. So it was, I agree that it was the right decision for
Yeah.
them to do their DIY it.
DIY postmortem.
DIY your postmortem photo. But yeah, like I mentioned, a lot of postmortem photos depict someone sleeping or in their coffin. So if you see someone who's dead, they do generally look like they're dead. There are some photos where people who have passed are like kind of like propped up or in a more lifelike posture. But those are definitely a little bit less common. And I I did want to just give like a quick shout out, something that wasn't I don't think able for a full episode, but since we're talking about Victorian photography, I did want to give a shout out to the hidden mothers of Victorian photography, which is something that you do see in some postmortem photography of children or younger
Mhm.
folks, but also of live ones where when people were having a picture of their baby, the mom was like, "Well, I need to hold the baby, but presumably I don't want to be in the photo, or we want the photo of the baby," so they'll be like draped in fabric
Yeah, the like
and look,
black cloaked
yeah, and it
figures.
does it does look very spooky, um and very weird. And I have it does kind of tie back because you do also see people claiming that if you see this, it means that the baby in the photo is dead, and that is just not like, that's not one to one. Like,
Yeah,
there are
no.
some postmortem photos, but that was just kind of
Sometimes you just
the
gotta hold that
standard.
baby in place.
You just gotta hold that baby in place. And it's like, how are you gonna make a baby hold still for 8 seconds? Like,
Yeah,
what are you gonna
you're
do here?
not.
You're just not. Um, in the US, there so this was like mostly popular in the UK and the US. But in the US, there was apparently a particular trend for funeral photos at the funeral service. So like with
Mhm.
everyone in attendance, and the casket on display, which like makes sense from like a capturing, an important moment perspective. But some of these photos do just kind of like look like a weird like birthday party photo
Yeah,
where
they really
it's
yes.
we're all
I
like, here we are at Dave's funeral, like, which is kind of fab. And just kind of a random side note, apparently there was also a major postmortem photography trend in Iceland.
Hmm.
A little bit later than this. I actually, if we have any listeners who are from Iceland, shout out, because they seem to have very interesting death practices and culture.
Hmm.
I would love to look into that more and learn a little bit more about it. But yes, postmortem photography faded out of public consciousness, generally as photography became something that a regular person could do and you didn't need to have like a photographer for. Like, it certainly still exists, that people take photos of
Mhm.
deceased loved ones, but it's not generally shared so openly because like you don't have to have like a photographer or anyone
Right.
else involved. I did read a New York Times article called "The iPhone at the Deathbed," which I
I
thought was
was
kind of a
hoping we were gonna talk about this, yes.
yes. I felt like the title seemed kind of like scandalous, but it was actually a pretty nice piece, just talking about postmortem photography as an act of death positivity,
Mhm.
recognizing death as something natural, and kind of the desire to commemorate your loved one, even in their final moments or post final moments. And they did talk in this specifically about an organization that is dedicated to connecting volunteer photographers with like parents of stillborn children,
Mm,
and kind of sort of the same kind of concept of Victorian postmodern photography, where you're like, this might be this is the only photo we have.
right.
um, so I think that that makes sense, and if that's something that people find comforting, then they certainly shouldn't, feel weird or bad about it. Like, it's a perfectly normal thing to want to have.
Yeah. I am bringing it back to the same place, but,
Hmm.
Amanda, again, talked about this in her speech about, um, that basically I think believe it she said it was her aunt who was
Hmm.
like, when Amanda's brother passed, asked if they wanted to take photos, and they were all like, "Oh my god, no." And her aunt was like, "Well, would you rather have taken them and not want them, or not taken them
Yeah.
and wish you had had them?" And so she shared with us that they did end up taking photos like with him at the end. And but I mean, if you think about it, I even saw one literally this morning. Um,
Hmm.
a girl who I went to high school with, her mother passed, and people that post the photos with their hand and their loved one's hand, I feel like I see that
Yeah.
all the time. And I mean, that's a version of postmortem photography. And I think
Yeah,
people,
it is.
forget that there are like, we have adapted a lot of practices in our own ways now. And we don't think of them as that, but it's what it's based in. And I don't know. I think it's I think it's comforting in a lot of ways.
Think that a lot of it is that obviously today we most often we actually probably see a lot more photographs of death, but
Mhm.
they're in very violent circumstances,
Right.
or they're crime scene photos, obviously war zone photos. um, and I think that it's kind of nice to reframe that in your mind as something that can be, an act of love. And I was, looking through Beyond the Veil yesterday, and it definitely felt like very meditative and not like lurid or
Right.
anything to look at these photos, because they are expressions of, love and care for these people.
Right. And I mean, my thing has always been, at the end of the day, who am I to dictate how someone grieves,
Oh, yeah.
right? So like
Hmm.
if that is something that someone finds to be comforting or something that they need in their process, then who are we to tell them otherwise, you know?
Yeah. For sure. Well, that is my tale of postmortem photographs. Another interesting part of Victorian death culture that, like you said, Midge, definitely still exists in its own forms as part of our culture today. And
Bring back
I think
Victorian
it's
mourning culture.
yeah.
No, I do think that we could benefit as a society from a little more reverence around death in a way that's more public, so that we all, it's one of the few things we all share.
Right.
One of the few things we all go through, and it's, I don't know. I think it's important.
I agree. All right. Well, a little sorry, guys. A little bit of a somber episode, but definitely an interesting topic.
Yeah.
If you have enjoyed the episode, we would love to get a review from you. That helps us spread the word about our show and get in touch with more folks. I do believe Midge has one to read today.
I sure do. One of our first Apple reviews in a while. Very exciting.
Hey.
And it is from Jenny? Hold on, sorry, my phone decided to not. So there we go. Jenna. It's from Jenna.
Mhm.
A 5-star review titled My Tribe, My Gould. I have followed both of you on IG for years as a vintage girl and watched Midge's show because it's right up my spooky vintage alley. How did it take me so long to listen to this? You gals are amazing and funny, and I am loving it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Glad to have you along for the ride.
Come on over. The water's fine.
I think we've had a an exciting surge of folks. I wore my Those Crazy Victorians shirt in a recent video, and so I think
Yes.
we've had a fun little surge of people coming over, and I've noticed a lot of people buying merch, and this is a great episode to plug that. We have
Right, it's true. I was gonna say, since we mentioned her in this episode, the lovely Amanda wore some of
yes,
our merch for one of her talks, which was so delightful.
with
Very
the
much
cutest
appreciated.
little lace collar edition
Yes.
too.
Oh
She
my
was
gosh.
rocking it. I loved that styling of it. Yeah,
So
if you would
cute.
like to check out our Those Crazy Victorians merchandise for the podcast, as well as our Ghouls Night In merch, you can check that out over on midgemonster.com/shop.
Heck yes. If you would like to follow along with the pod, you can follow us on Instagram at Ghouls Night In Pod. And if you want to see me, you can find me across the internet at Penny Snark.
And you can find me all over the web at Midge Munster.
And until next time,
Goodbye.
goodbye.